Ah,
Okay.
thank you. Thanks. Everything to the left of modern Orthodoxy, including modern Orthodoxy, is trying to balance the right amount of connection to tradition and openness to the modern world. Every single stream is trying to do that in their own way, and they draw lines in different places, but the principle of having a healthy balance between modernity and Jewish tradition is at the core of every single Jewish stream in the modern context. So I want to say so that Rabbi Starr talked about that as being at the center of conservative Judaism, which is absolutely the case, and it's also true for reform. From my perspective, at least, I'll say it's true for Reform, Reconstructionist, Renewal, Modern Orthodoxy, humanistic Judaism. Every modern expression of Judaism is trying to find what it considers to be the right balance of those two influences. So that's the first thing I wanted to say. The second thing I wanted to say, which is related to that, is that every stream of modern Judaism is responding to the same historical stimulus and trying to solve new problems that arose in the modern period: intellectual problems, spiritual problems, sociological problems that all were generated by the combination of the Enlightenment in Western Europe that elevated human rationality above the power of tradition to have authority over the decisions that we make, and the emancipation process, which allowed Jewish individuals to become citizens of their countries. And those two processes together created chaos in the Jewish community because up until that point, Jews, for better and for worse, had lived in very insular communities. And so all of Jewish life was internally very logical up until the modern period. But that logic was absolutely exploded as Jews were invited into the modern conversation and enthusiastically accepted that invitation for the most part. So every modern stream of Judaism is trying to respond to two core questions that the Enlightenment and Emancipation raised for Jewish people. One question was, what is the nature of Jewish identity? Some people thought it was primarily a religious identity. Some people thought it was primarily an ethnic identity. Some people thought it was primarily a national identity, and all permutations and combinations of those answers. So, what is the nature of Jewish identity was a big question. And what is the nature of what is this thing we call Judaism? What is that? Is it a religion? Is it a I've got a whole list of possible answers to that question. Um, where did I put the let's see. Oh yeah. Um, well, on top of what it is, there are all these questions about how Judaism functions. So, in other words, whether there has been change or whether it's been persistent throughout history in terms of its content. Who has authority to make decisions and changes in Jewish tradition? What's the relative role played by human beings versus divinity in the generation of Jewish tradition? What parts of Jewish tradition are central and what parts are peripheral? How open should Judaism be to modern culture? All of these questions around Jewish tradition, each stream had its own answer to. So that's the general backdrop, is that every stream is trying to answer all these questions, and Mordechai Kaplan and the Reconstructionist movement had its own unique answers to those questions. So I'm going to kind of jump. I'm going to I will say, just in case people aren't aware, that functionally the Reconstructionist movement is really an outgrowth of conservative Judaism. So I'm glad that Rabbi Starr presented last week, because that's one of the distinguishing features. Sometimes people that are looking at liberal movements compare Reconstructionism and Reform, and one of the differences is that the Reconstructionist movement emerged from the conservative movement, and so the conservative movement, the Reconstructionist movement, had a inherently more positive view of ritual, for example, than the Reform movement did for a long time. That has changed, and we'll hear more about that next week from Rabbi Van. But classical Reform in the United States, for the most part, did not consider the ritual part of Judaism important at all, and in some cases, it considered ritual detrimental to spiritual development. And the Reconstructionist movement, for the most part, has never taken that, embraced that kind of critique of Jewish ritual. So that's one of the even though philosophically speaking, in terms of the the freedom of individuals to make their own choices, there's a lot of agreement and overlap between Reconstructionism and Reform Judaism. But we'll circle back to that. Okay, so what was unique about Kaplan? Kaplan grew up in a modern Orthodox Eastern European family. His father was an Orthodox rabbi from Lithuania, and they moved. Kaplan was born in 1881. I believe, I should have double-checked the date. I believe his family moved to New York when he was about 8 or 9 years old, so, around 1890 or so. And then he really came of age in New York and fully exposed to kind of all of the dynamics of a churning, turn-of-the-century U.S. culture. And also, along with tons of other Eastern European Jewish immigrants who were in the middle of this, major wave of Eastern European Jewish immigration between 1880 and 1920, and his family came really smack dab in the middle of that. So he was part of, and he, was aware of being part of this major migration of Eastern European Jews to the United States. I mentioned his father was an Orthodox rabbi. His father was the assistant chief rabbi of New York City, as a matter of fact. And so obviously Kaplan had a very traditional household, but his parents also saw themselves as being relatively modern. And so when they hired tutors for their son Mordechai, some of their tutors came out of a pretty modern framework in terms of understanding Judaism and understanding the Torah. And one of Kaplan's most impactful tutors was someone who was quite knowledgeable about the documentary hypothesis in terms of the Torah being written by numerous different authors and then being, put together by an editor. And so that was an idea that Kaplan was exposed to from a very young age. And so that's just an example of the fact that from a very young age, Kaplan was deeply embedded in Jewish culture and history, and also American society and American culture, and very modern ideas about religion. And he pursued both of those tracks all the way. He in terms of his college years, he studied at both Columbia and JTS. He studied social science. He studied sociology and anthropology, and he saw the social sciences actually as a real gift to modern religious people in terms of helping modern religious people to understand how religion functioned and what it could continue to do in the modern context. And he was in a small minority of religious leaders that felt positively towards social science, because most religious leaders at the turn of the 20th century felt that social science was a disaster for religious life. They just saw it as being undermining of a lot of religious, truths that they held to be foundational. That was not Kaplan's perspective. He thought social science was going to be the vehicle that brought religion into the modern world and sustained it in the modern world. Okay. So, what did Kaplan? I want to talk about Kaplan's answer to these, these questions of what's the nature of Jewish identity and Jewish tradition. So, he had unique answers to those questions. He said that Jewish identity is at its base about belonging to a people, the Jewish people. And that answer is one that was so overarching that it encompassed all the other answers that were given by the different streams of Judaism. So there was, within the concept of people, there was room for, certainly there was room for religion. I mean, religion was, at the center of it, but there was room for ethnicity, there was room for nationhood, and but peoplehood was bigger than all of those things. And so that was one unique answer that Kaplan gave. The other one that had to do with Jewish tradition, and again, I think these are words that are very familiar to many people who are here this evening. He said, was Judaism a religion? Was it an ethnicity? And he said Judaism was a civilization, a religious civilization. Again, a concept that was large enough to encompass all of the other answers that were given by different streams in terms of what the nature of Judaism and Jewish tradition was. Religion he saw was being at the center, but there were many aspects that transcended religion proper about, in terms of the content of Jewish civilization. So those were both really central concept in Kaplan's thought. So one other thing I want to say about, and again, this goes to the distinction between Reconstructionism and Reform. The Reform movement was created in Western Europe, in France and in Germany and in England, and it responded quite directly to the Enlightenment. Kaplan's Judaism, which became Reconstructionism, was created in America, and it grew out of the encounter between the modern world and Eastern European Judaism, which was very different from Western European Judaism in some ways. So Eastern European Judaism had a much stronger national and ethnic component than Western European Judaism did in the modern period. So that's why most of the more nationalistic aspects of Jewish identity really came out of Central and Eastern Europe. Zionism was primarily a Central and Eastern European phenomenon, not a Western European phenomenon. Bundism was an Eastern European phenomenon. This idea of Jews as a nation, as an ethnic group, was much more prominent in Eastern Europe than in Western Europe. So Kaplan in the United States, he was bringing an Eastern European sensibility to the encounter with the modern world in the U.S., and that, in part, explains the cultural and just the difference in feel between a typical Reform congregation and a typical Reconstructionist congregation, because a lot of the trappings of tradition were seen as, everything else being equal, were seen as valuable in the context of the Eastern European conversation, whereas in the Western European conversation, in the Reform movement, initially, a lot of those trappings, whether we were talking about Hebrew language or certain kinds of ritual observances, were really seen as not that significant, not that important, or as we said before, even problematic. So that is even though there's a lot of overlap between the two streams in many ways, that sense of kind of the traditional aesthetic was it just was very different between the two of them. So I want to say, all right, one more thing I want to say about Kaplan. I said earlier that every stream was trying to balance the connection to Jewish tradition and the modern world and the emphasis that each got in the lives in the life of the Jewish community and the lives of individual Jews. And Kaplan, more than any other modern Jewish thinker, wanted to go all in on both. He didn't want to sacrifice any of the Jewish piece, and he did not want to sacrifice any of the American modern piece. He wanted both. He wanted both very prominently, and he wanted them to be interacting with each other. And that was very unusual amongst the streams of Judaism. Usually in different ways, the modern American sensibility and the Jewish sensibility were each compartmentalized. And you did your Jewish stuff at certain times and in certain places, and your American stuff at other times and in other places. And, they didn't necessarily overlap that much. And the less they overlapped, the better. Kaplan had the opposite intention. He thought the more overlap, the more richness there would be, certainly for American Jews, but he believed also for American non-Jews. He was very deeply committed to the notion that Jewish civilization could add some significant elements to American culture. All right. I think that is what I want to talk a little bit about what I think are the gifts that Reconstructionist Judaism has brought to, let me say, let me say a little bit more about Kaplan and Reconstructionism proper. So a lot of these phrases are very familiar to people. The past gets a vote, but not a veto. Again, this kind of balance of treating the past as important, but not giving the past an automatic, that we automatically follow what was said in the past. These things have to be in dialogue. Jewish tradition and contemporary experience have to be in dialogue with each other. And theoretically, sometimes we might go in the direction of one of them, and at other times we might go in the direction of the other of them, and at other times there might be a new answer that is an integration of the two that no one had ever come up with before. So that is both the past gets a vote, not a veto, and this other notion of living in two civilizations. Now we would say living in multiple civilizations because we live in a global society. I apologize for the phone ringing. It'll stop in a second. But again, this notion of bringing these two civilizations, the Jewish and the American, into dialogue with each other, enriching both in the process. And so those were both important concepts. The evolution of Judaism, the evolving religious civilization of the Jewish people, that was kind of Kaplan's very technical definition of Judaism. The evolving religious civilization of the Jewish people. Very clearly, he saw that not just Judaism, but all religion, he believed, this was his social science background speaking, evolves over time and space. It changes in response to new situations, new understandings, new encounters. And so he saw that Judaism had evolved significantly over the course of time, and this was very much in contrast to an Orthodox perspective, which would see kind of the core revelation being given at Mount Sinai, and basically that core being carried forward from generation to generation. And that's a very different view from what Kaplan understood. it's a religious civilization. So this notion of, living in such a way that maximizes meaning, that maximizes our ability to achieve what Kaplan referred to somewhat controversially as salvation. This notion that human beings can live closer to their potential. That was really how he understood what salvation meant. And we could only do that in the context of our religious community. So the religious dimension was at the center of Jewish civilization. It was of the Jewish people, but not of God. He was very clear that Judaism was a cultural creation of a group of people called the Jews, in response to powerful spiritual stimuli, but the culture and the practices were human created, human generated, and that all of these things differentiated Kaplan from not totally, because the conservative movement and the reform movement also saw historical progression taking place, but, and I hate to speak for, we heard already Rabbi Starr say, but I think he acknowledged even that the conservative movement recognized historical development, but the process of change, the process by which change could happen, is very slow from the conservative perspective, because there has to be, the group of rabbis have to debate, different legal responses to new situations, and maybe they'll agree, maybe they won't agree, maybe there'll be 5 different opinions. The reform movement, in some ways, moved very quickly, but Kaplan's critique of the reform movement was that they left behind a lot of the guts of Jewish civilization that had a lot of value. And so he thought he had, as every tradition, every stream thinks it has the right balance. Kaplan felt he had the right balance of these things. The God idea for Kaplan was very, very different from many of his contemporaries. This notion of God as a force rather than a being. While that concept did exist in certain parts of Jewish tradition that preceded Kaplan, he ran with it in a way that no one had ever run with it before, to the extent that he really, I think, totally dropped the concept of divine being and really, focused on divine process and divine force. So that was so there was no chosen people. There couldn't be. You can't have a chosen people if there's no being who's doing the choosing. So Reconstructionism, Kaplan, that was one of the few pieces of Jewish tradition that Kaplan felt couldn't be reconstructed, because it just, on top of the fact that it was theologically and intellectually problematic for him, he also thought it was morally problematic in the modern world. And so it had 3 strikes, and so he just said, let's just let it go. By the way, there are some modern Reconstructionists who push back a little bit on Kaplan's openness to completely dropping, at least in a mythic sense, the concept of chosenness. But Kaplan was very clear about it. And I think the majority of Reconstructionist thinkers today still agree with him about that. Okay, let me stop and see. I want to next talk about what I think are the major gifts that Reconstructionism brings to the table for modern Jews. Talk about my attraction to the movement, how I ended up as a Reconstructionist, and then talk a little bit about maybe some of the challenges we face. Because every movement has its challenges, right? There's no such thing as a particular every choice has upsides and downsides to it. So, any questions up till now before we continue forward? Lila?
At Rabbi Deborah's talk, she said something, I'm not going to get it exactly, but she said, no sooner had, Mordechai Kaplan opened his new shul on the Upper West Side that he went to his board of directors and said, I want to have this new ritual, and it was a bat mitzvah. And I just wondering whether it also came from where it came from, and whether it was Kaplan was the originator of this. That there's something about, like, we're not going to wait for responses. There's like a do-it-yourself quality to Reconstructionism that I feel like I haven't seen in other movements.
No, that's yeah, that's actually a really interesting point, because if Kaplan, I mean, maybe he was trying to engage his lay leaders in a, discernment process by bringing this to them, or maybe, I think in theory he did believe that these kinds of things should be processed through the community, and I guess he did that to some extent. But he also was someone who had very strong opinions about what should be. And the other story that's similar to the bat mitzvah story was a, quote unquote, a happy ending, in that they went forward, and she, Judith had her bat mitzvah. We just celebrated the 100th anniversary of this. And although it did take quite a while for this to catch on in other parts of the American Jewish community, I think it certainly set the stage for that to happen. The opposite example is the Kol Nidre example, where Kaplan kind of decided one year that he didn't like Kol Nidre. He thought it was a ridiculous prayer if you look at the content. And he decided he was just going to take it out of the Erev Yom Kippur ceremony, and he did. And his community was extremely upset with him. And the next year, he put it back, because even though he thought it was wrong and didn't make any sense, he also recognized that it had meaning for people, whether or not it was rational, from his perspective. So I do think there is a, I think these are both, there is this kind of community conversation process, but there's also this kind of this open to experimentation that doesn't necessarily have to always run through. Like, the experimentation is part of the community conversation sometimes, and sometimes the experimentation precedes the community conversation. So I think that's right. I think that is part of the culture.
And it doesn't have to come through from the rabbi. I mean, the experimentation, which seems to me certainly different than the conservative movement, but like, his community didn't like it, and so they had a say. And so anyway. Okay, yeah. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. All right, Alan, and then Kevin or Sue, or both of you. Yeah.
So you might be going to talk about this coming up, but I was curious about when he called, or he deemed God to be did you say a force?
A force or a process, yeah.
So could you say more about what that force or process is?
I can try. This is one of the slipperiest parts of Kaplanian thought, because he does talk differently about it in different places. And this would be a great question to ask Rabbi Deborah, because she's an expert in Kaplan's, or Mel Skult is, who has published his diaries. But my less, scholarly take on that question is that, Kaplan's faith in God was connected to an idea. It was connected to this idea of evolution, and that the universe over time was becoming more ordered and more imbued with divinity. That this divine force was not all powerful, but over time it was entering into more and more of the universal life, including human life. And, here are two questions about it that really, as far as I'm concerned, have never been absolutely answered. Is this force more like electricity? Is it something that is completely, it's there, but there is no conscious dimension to it in any way? To what extent is it inevitable, and to what extent does it require human participation and openness to advance? Both of those questions, I think, are somewhat open in the study of Kaplan's thought. Sometimes he sounded more like this was a force that, was just embedded in the universe, and it was going to move forward regardless of the actions of human beings. And at other times he writes about it and says, really human beings have a lot to say about how much I'm just looking at where it can be observed in the positive interactions between the different dimensions of the universe. Thank you, Lila. So sometimes it does sound like human beings have some say in how quickly the force moves forward. Sometimes it sounds like maybe there is some intentionality behind the force, and sometimes not. So it's not a very satisfying answer. It's a great question, and but I think he did overall believe that things were moving in a direction. I think you could compare it in some ways a little bit to what's the Martin Luther King quote about the moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice. So I think Kaplan would have basically agreed with, and he probably did. He was alive when Martin Luther King said those words, so he probably affirmed them in some context. So I think he probably would have bought into that basic understanding, although Martin Luther King's idea of God was very different, I think, than Kaplan's idea of God. But the moral arc, the universe heading in a direction, he mostly did agree with. Kevin?
I'm curious about practice, and I'm curious about did Kaplan himself do these three things that I noticed right away in a Reconstructionist service? 1, fewer aliot; 2, group aliot; and 3, no musaf.
That's a great question. I don't know the answer to that off the top of my head, number one. Number two, I think I know the source of group aliyot, and it's not Mordechai Kaplan. It's Reb Zalman Schachter Shalomi. As far as I understand it, he came up with the notion of group aliyot, and many Reconstructionist rabbinical students were exposed to that when we were going to school in Philadelphia, and Reb Zalman and Rabbi Arthur Waskow were living, Rabbi Arthur Waskow still does live in Philadelphia, and their community was one of the communities that was holding Shabbat services, and so many rabbinical students at RRC were exposed to Reb Zalman's approach in that way, and many of us thought that was a really neat idea and brought it with us out of rabbinical school to the different settings that we landed in. My guess is that Kaplan was pretty traditional in his practice in most ways. I mean, he certainly did experiment. There's the great story about him leaving his tefillin on while he read John Dewey, because that felt like Torah study, it's one of my favorite stories about him. But the service, okay, there was a bat mitzvah, a bat mitzvah, because it wasn't like every bar mitzvah, but it was his daughter who who was called to the Torah, even if she didn't read from the Torah the way she would have if she had been born a boy. My guess, the Musaf, it wouldn't shock me if he got rid of Musaf. I don't know the answer. But I imagine he had 7 aliyot on Shabbat. That would be my guess. I think the 3 aliyot thing is a relatively recent development. It's interesting that it seems to have happened spontaneously across many different Reconstructionist congregations, because I don't think people have, like, I never talked to colleagues about 3 aliyot. Like, in our context, it was really a pragmatic decision because we wanted to stay within a certain time frame, and I knew if we went over 3, we were going to be challenged to do it with 3. And if we went over 3, no way were we going to get done in 2 hours. So, but lots and lots of Reconstructionist congregations, it turns out, now do 3 aliyot on Shabbat instead of 7. So good question. Thank you. All right, any other questions before I'm going to talk a little bit about kind of, I guess, a more meta kind of perspective on this. Okay, so here are the gifts that I think Reconstructionist Judaism has brought to the American Jewish community. The possibility of deeply integrating Jewish tradition with modern experience and creativity. That integration, like, I think that happens it's not that there aren't non-Reconstructionist congregations who do that, but I think that really came out of a Reconstructionist framework, and it's spread beyond the Reconstructionist movement. But when you can go to a service and hear poetry from all over the world as, legitimately and authentically part of Jewish liturgy, I think that's a pretty neat thing. Or you can hear melodies, from very different kinds of sources. So that's one gift. I think the strong emphasis on diversity and inclusion within Reconstructionist communities is a gift that Reconstructionism has brought to the American Jewish community. Not alone. The Reform movement has been pretty close behind us, but we've always been a little bit, out ahead of the Reform movement. So when it's talking about including women, including LGBTQ people, including Jews of color, including non-Jews as members of the Jewish community, all of those things, and beyond. Those are the first categories that come to mind. But that is, and I think that really did grow out of. Kaplan didn't always specifically address each of those dimensions, but he role modeled the importance of being more inclusive, and then the movement later on took that idea and I think expanded it and extrapolated it, and we now have a movement that is philosophically extremely committed to diversity and inclusion. The notion of lay and rabbinic partnership and collaboration, I think that is a gift of the Reconstructionist movement to the American Jewish community. I don't think any other Jewish stream comes close to us on that one. The Reform movement, from my experience, again, I'm sure there are exceptions to this, but the professional Jews in Reform synagogues are still very much at the center of decision making and of ritual leadership and of learning leadership. Again, it's a generalization, but that's always been an important value, that rabbis and lay leaders and lay people in general are partners, and we work together. And just like tradition doesn't get a veto, the rabbi doesn't get a veto. you know. So I think that's an important contribution. And the last one I'll mention is the theological openness of Reconstructionist Judaism. You know, not everybody resonates with Kaplan's idea of the divine, but his idea was different enough from what came before that I think it kind of broke the mold of what the boundaries that people felt like they needed to be within when they were talking about what is God, what is divinity. And so I think because of that, and this was my experience when I was in rabbinical school, and it's been my experience, at Kohalev, that we just have a real openness to a wide range, including, people who are very comfortable with a confirmed atheism, people who are comfortable with some kind of theistic belief, and everything in between. And it's all acceptable, and it's all authentic. And so I think that's a gift that Reconstructionist Judaism brings to the American Jewish community. Let me talk about some of our challenges, which I think, we have challenges. One challenge, there isn't any good soundbite definition for Reconstructionism. This is if you're trying to like explain to someone, you say you belong to a Reconstructionist congregation, they're like, oh, what is that? I've never heard of it before. That's a tough moment, right? And it's so pervasive that the movement over time has had several iterations of inviting people to compose elevator answers to that question, because it's just very difficult to do in a spontaneous way. So that's only somewhat tongue-in-cheek, but it's really, I think it is. I think that's a challenge for us. We are a much smaller movement than many of the other movements, and we don't have the same level of resources that other movements have. Now, sometimes that's an advantage. At this particular moment, it's actually an advantage for us, because being smaller means that we could adapt more quickly institutionally to changes in the American Jewish context. And we were the first movement to combine our rabbinical school and our congregational arm. And now it looks like the other movements are heading in that direction. And that brought some efficiencies to our movement that didn't exist previously. And it also has led to, we went through a period of time, and Rabbi Deborah has mentioned this in her talks to us recently. There was a pretty scary, lean time not too long ago where there was a real question about the, financial stability of the movement. I think there's been a little bit of an improvement in that situation that has mirrored the increase in people applying to rabbinical school. There was a time, I'm not sure how many people were in this year's graduating class, but last year's with Rachel and Miriam, there were 4 students in that class. I don't know how many were in this one, but the last 2 entering classes, I think, were more like between 10 and 15 students. So it's a significant shift upwards. And right now, the other movements are feeling a little bit of envy that we were able to adapt as quickly as we did, and our small size allowed us to do that. So that cuts in both directions. But we do, financial resources across the board are always challenging for us for that reason. And the last thing I'll say, I hope this doesn't sound too controversial. I just think this is the truth, that we have a very strong process orientation in our movement, which I think usually is a good thing. Sometimes, on rare occasions, we get lost in process to the extent that we never end up achieving what we set out to achieve at the beginning. So that's again, it's not a constant issue, but it's, that's part of the, the piece of pie that we have, because we've made the choices that we have. So it's still the piece of pie that I want, but I think that's a challenge that we have. Okay. I want to just say the last thing I want to talk about is like what drew me to this movement, because I was not part of it growing up. And then if there are more, I don't know if there are other questions or comments that people want to make. So I didn't grow up Reconstructionist. I grew up in Flint, Michigan, where there were two synagogues, a Reform and a Conservative synagogue. And my family belonged to both of them at different, or each of them, I should say, at different times. In part because my parents were a mixed marriage between an Eastern European traditional family, my mom's side, and a Western European German Jewish highly assimilated family on my dad's side. My dad was really uncomfortable in the conservative synagogue that we started going to, and he actually he wouldn't agree to even come with us because he didn't want to put on a tallis, he didn't want to put on a kippah, he just had never done that before, and God forbid anyone should offer him tefillin. Like that was, that scared him more than anything else. So after several years of that, my mom said to him, look, if we joined the Reform synagogue, would you come to services? And he said he would. So we switched when I was like 6 or 7. Anyway, I think it's relevant because I think having been exposed to both Reform and Conservative Judaism, it did set me up to be open to Reconstructionism. I think that wasn't a bad setup to be open to Reconstructionism. But I didn't know anything about Reconstructionism until I finished college. At one point, when I had decided I was going to go spend a year in Israel after I graduated, and my mom sent me an article. She had read it about Reconstructionism. This is like 1986 or 87. And she was intrigued with Reconstruction. She had never heard of it before. She said, oh, there's this really cool new movement called Reconstructionism. And I don't think I ever read the article. I mean, she sent it to me. I was, 20 or 21, and I don't think I ever read it. But I did go to Israel after I graduated from college. I spent a year studying at Pardes, and then I stayed for a second year, and I volunteered with an organization called Shirut La'am, which means service to the people. I did an ulpan in Jerusalem, and then I moved to Ashkelon, where I worked with a bunch of, they basically had us interning in schools in poor neighborhoods to help with English and that kind of thing. And but I met a whole bunch of Reconstructionist rabbinical students when I was at Pardes, and in the second year when I was doing Shirut La'am, I still had friends in Jerusalem, and there was a whole group of Reconstructionist rabbinical students studying at Hebrew University that year, and I met a bunch of them. And I had spent time with lots of different rabbinical students, especially at Pardes. We had Shabbat meals every week, and I met people who were studying to be Reform rabbis at HUC and conservative rabbis at JTS, and there were tons of people at Pardes who were thinking about going on to getting Orthodox ordination. And so I met lots of different rabbinical students, but the Reconstructionists that I met were just so much more compelling to me and interesting to me compared to the other rabbinical students. And the reasons, there were two main reasons for that. One was that whereas the Reform and conservative rabbinical students, for the most part, had grown up in the Reform and conservative movements, respectively, and kind of had been on this path to rabbinical school since they were in, high school. They were the, either the religious vice presidents of their youth groups, or they were the presidents of their youth groups. And then they went to college, and they were the presidents of their Hillels. And then the next logical step was to go to rabbinical school. So they'd all gone to camp. They'd all gone to the movement camp. So they had been kind of on this path to rabbinical school since they were 14 or 15 years old. Among the Reconstructionists, they had grown up in as wide a range of different environments as you can imagine. So they were a small group, but they were incredibly diverse in terms of there were some people who had grown up like ultra frum, and other people who had grown up completely secular, and everything in between. And so they just had a wide range of backgrounds that they would bring to the conversation. The other thing that was a little bit different about the Reconstructionist students that I met that's not quite the same today as it was then is that almost all of them were second career rabbis, as opposed to the Reform and Conservative and Orthodox students that I met they were all going into rabbinical school right out of college. So that was very different. A lot of these Reconstructionist students had families, and they'd done other things professionally, and so they just had a totally different mindset and just a different perspective that they were bringing to their rabbinical studies. So that was attractive to me. I was also drawn to the commitment of the movement to diversity and inclusion that we've talked about already. I grew up in a family where my favorite relative still is my Uncle Bruce, who happens to be gay. And when I went to Israel, I knew that about him. He was out to our family. And the Rabbinical College had established a non-discrimination policy on the basis of sexual orientation in 1987. That was before the Reform movement, way before the conservative movement. It was the first rabbinical school to have that policy, and that was very moving to me that they had that commitment. So that was something that called to me. There was this really unusual combination of kind of respect and empowerment vis-a-vis Jewish tradition. Like there was a sense of respect for it, like it was important, but it was also something that you could argue with and, use in a new way if you could see a way to do that made sense. So that was very exciting to me. And it was all of Jewish tradition too. That was the other thing. A lot of the other rabbinical students, had a narrower view of like what constituted their rabbinical education. But in the Reconstructionist context, because it was a civilizational model, you would study so many different expressions of Judaism, both historically and in the contemporary context, that wouldn't be part of the curriculum in other rabbinical schools. So that was interesting to me. And lastly, and this goes back, I think, to what Lila's question was, the openness to experimentation and creativity, again, vis-a-vis tradition and trying out new things, and there was a sense, you could call it creativity, but there was a sense of play, not in a negative way, but where you could experiment with elements of tradition and see what would happen. And that was something I didn't see going on. Whether, each movement had its own kind of halacha, its own kind of things that they decided were, this is it. And in the Reconstructionist conversation, everything was fair game, in Jewish tradition. And we used to joke about, bringing back animal sacrifice, not to the temple, heaven forfend, but, but a more, even more traditional, where people would people talked about like a religious barbecue, So anyway, I never saw anyone. I did see someone do that in a vegetarian style, but never, with actual animals. So, all right. I think that was what I wanted to say, and I'm happy to take any questions or comments, whether it's about, my own take on things or Reconstructionism more generally, so please. Alan?
So I didn't get to see your talk on Shavuos about prayer. And I was wondering about when you pray, we used to have when I was a kid, I remember having an image, I was praying to, praying to somebody who was listening, And so I wonder, what's your experience of prayer?
Wow, that's a great question. And actually this morning in the schmooze, someone asked a similar question that I said, I think I'll wait until tonight and see if anyone asks me a question like that. And look, prayer is challenging. I will not try to say anything else about it. And I think prayer works best when the person praying has some definitive idea of what they're doing. And it doesn't have to be the same for each person. I think if you don't have an idea, it doesn't mean you can't do it, but I think it's a little fuzzier. The experience is a little fuzzier. And prayer has been something that I've, wrestled with for my entire life, personally and professionally. Let me see. So I'll say this. Part of what I struggle with most in terms of Kaplanian theology is his version of the divine force, which doesn't have, there's no consciousness element to it. So it is really like kind of electricity. And it doesn't make sense to me, if one believes in any kind of force in the universe, it doesn't make sense to me that force could be without consciousness entirely, given that we have consciousness. Like, it's hard to believe that we are at a higher level than the divine force in the universe, which doesn't mean that the divine force has a, specific agenda or again, because I don't personally believe that this divine force, I think we are all part of this divine force. That's the other thing that's a little complicated about it, right? If you believe that you're a part of something, what does it mean to pray? And so I would say that when I am in a good prayer space, it has the characteristic that I am feeling like a part of this larger divine process, and I am trying to open myself up to that. And I choose to believe that if I express myself in the context of this larger divine process, that it's meaningful on some level. And I don't know that I can go any further than that in terms of, obviously there's no proof to that, but that the universe is constructed in such a way that the articulation of human experience is a meaningful act in and of itself, regardless of whether there's another human being who's listening. I don't know. So that's...
I appreciate your answer. And I think it, if you think about human psychology and nature, when we feel connected to others and to nature, we feel most alive and most meaningful. And when we feel disconnected, those things are missing, and we struggle. And so your explanation makes a lot of sense to me. Thank you.
Just
Thank
quickly,
you.
you brought that into services, the idea of a collective intent, like with several times, and I think you had a period where there were scientific articles where there was evidence that collective intent for healing and stuff did have an impact. So I've always liked that part of.
So thank you, Lila, for that. So that is, I think that also is part of prayer, and I would maybe have a second category for that, because well, or maybe not. That human beings collectively and individually, when they marshal their intention, it's not that there's a God who decides whether or not to answer a prayer, but that humans, part of our human inheritance is the ability to marshal our intentionality in such a way that it could have, again, I don't think it's a one-to-one correspondence, but I don't think it's nothing. I don't think it's nothing. And so that motivates me to be a part of group prayer, because I do think that it might have an impact, and even that possibility to me makes it very worthwhile. Now, there are people who don't believe that, who have lots of other good reasons that motivate them to pray, but that happened in addition to those other reasons. This is also motivating to me. Louise and Joel?
Oh, well, I just had a question. Did you say that both your parents were actually born abroad? And if so, can you just mention the towns that they came from?
Oh, sorry. No, actually they were both born in the States, but my mom's family is totally Eastern European, Ashkenazic, but she's like a second generation person. My dad's family, almost all from Germany, but he's a sixth generation American Jew. So that was the mixed marriage part. And it really was culturally, I think, the two families were extremely different in almost every way, from culinary tastes to political leanings to, and it's amazing that they actually got along. I mean, like the sets of in-laws, for example, because they just were very, very different. But they were both born in the States, and I apologize if I
apologize. I was just curious. Yeah, it's fine. Okay, I'm done.
Thanks, Joel.
When you were talking about the movement being able to adapt quickly, I thought you were going to talk about to the pandemic, because clearly, at least Kol Halev adapted very quickly. And, there were just those few weeks where it was live streamed, and then going to Zoom, and because of the small size of the congregation, Zoom has worked very well for this period for us, and certainly for Torah study or for adult education like this, where it's one screen.
Right.
It's been very good. And the other thing I was going to say, so you as a potential rabbinic student and as a rabbi, feel at home in Reconstructionism and in Kol Halev, but as a new member to this congregation, and as somebody who for most of my life was in conservative congregations, I feel very at home and supported in this congregation, and able to so things. I was talking to Joel the other day that that when I like listen to the Richard Elliott Friedman lectures or go to the Jewish Studio Project, I feel like very comfortable talking about them within this congregation and with other members here. And I wouldn't always in other settings.
Thanks so much, Louise. Thank you. Judy, and then Robin.
Yeah, Rabbi, I wonder if you could address for a little bit kind of the future in terms of the movement, kind of in terms of youth. I don't know statistically, but I have kind of a sense that Reconstructionist schools don't have as many strong educational programs, certainly that extend beyond minimal programs. Like I think ours is terrific, but it is, in terms of a comprehensive Jewish education, there are things that we just can't do because we are small, because we don't have the kids, because we don't have the resources. And I think that's not unusual. That's at least my sense, although again, I don't know exactly. We have the camp, and that reaches kids. And as a Ramat person, I do appreciate the importance of camps. But I'm wondering if from a movement perspective, you can tell us a little bit more about what's going on and how you see that impacting either in a positive way or in a negative way, the future of the movement.
Whoa. That's a good question, a big question. First, I just want to say I don't think I'm the most qualified person to speak in terms of movement trends, generally, but I think it's important, and we may in fact be digging into that a little bit, not in the not too distant future within Koholev in terms of thinking about our future. My just gut level thought about it would be that there's probably a lot of variation between different Reconstructionist communities, and it probably tracks pretty closely. I'm total guess now. I don't have any data about this, but I would just imagine it tracks pretty closely with this overall size of the Jewish community that the Reconstructionist congregation is embedded in. So, I think that or maybe the size of the Reconstructionist community, maybe regardless of the overall size of the Jewish community, but I think JRC in Chicago has a very, has a large number of, I'm imagining, just from what I've heard from the rabbi there, a very, lots of kids in the religious school program. I think the congregation in LA, the congregation in Atlanta, the congregations in New York, although probably maybe there's some variation even in the New York context. I do think, you can maybe speak to this better than I feel like I have heard that like at Adat Shalom in Bethesda, which at one time was bursting at the seams in fact, they had to cap the number of religious school students at one time because the community decided they didn't want to have bar and bat mitzvah ceremonies every week. And they wanted to have a certain number of Shabbatot that would not be B'nai Mitzvah ceremonies. But that's no longer an issue because the population of young families there has decreased as it has in our context as well. I think the pandemic has thrown a real monkey wrench into a certain aspect of youth programming, because we used to do a little bit more, and again, we were never great at this, but we used to do a little bit more of regional stuff with Reconstructionist communities that were, within driving distance. So that hasn't happened since 2020. In places where there are multiple congregations, maybe that's, so a place maybe like New York or Chicago or Washington, that might be possible even in a pandemic context. So I think it's a challenge. I think it's a challenge that is present for all liberal forms of Judaism and also all liberal forms of Christianity. I think this is a liberal religious challenge across the board, where the participation of children and youth and young families has dropped off significantly in the last 20 years. And I think there are lots of conversations underway to try to figure out like why that has happened and what to do about it. Clearly, we have to do something, all of us need to do something, because if we don't, if the number of youth drops below a certain threshold, then, the future of the movement and the future of the Jewish community looks very different. And so I wish I had more concrete data to base my response on. But I think it's a very important question to be asking, and I think it's an important focus for liberal religious communities of all stripes to be concerned about. Thank you. Thanks. Robin?
So I was interested in when you talked about the idea of chosenness, because, from a young age, I grew up in a Reform synagogue, and from a very young age, I was just horrified by the idea of chosenness. But more in terms of just like, we don't have, how can we say we were, but when you talked about it was a theological thing, because Kaplan said, how can we talk about chosenness if we don't believe that there's this entity, but, rather just a force? So I was like really interested in that, because it was, I don't know, maybe I've heard it before and I just forgot, but I thought that was really interesting, because I just never recall us having that conversation about that it's about, not having some kind of divine entity that would choose us.
Yeah.
But the other thing that I think of about one of the things I love about Reconstructionism is that we have taken out the idea of a Messiah. And, we'll talk about the Messianic age, but even in the Reform movement, they still use that language, and have this, as far as I know, the sense of, that waiting for a Messiah. So I don't know. That's just my two comments.
Thank you, Robin. Yeah, I will say, let me just say very clearly, I think you can have a more traditional view of God and still completely reject chosenness. I think for Kaplan, it was a real combination. It was a somewhat easier call for him because his theology really didn't support, from a logical point of view, the emotional, the emotional draw to the notion of chosenness. But I think you can have a very traditional theology and still say, when I would meet with other rabbinical students, and we'd sometimes debate this chosenness thing, because some people would say, well, without chosenness, what's the point? Why bother? If we can't be confident that we are doing exactly what God wants us to be doing, like, who cares? So that was what they would say. And I would say, I would always draw an analogy to family systems. And I would say, in a healthy family system, every child feels equally loved. And if there's a sense on the part of some children that there's one child that is preferred in whatever way by the parents, that is a very destructive dynamic. And I said, and so even in a traditional theological context, it just never made, why would it just doesn't make any sense to me why there would be things would get set up in that way. So anyway, yeah, but for Kaplan, he had this additional support that it was just completely absurd in his theological in his theological system to talk about chosenness. Now, I can imagine that the experience of chosenness could have been spontaneously generated amongst the ancient Israelites if they had some kind of collective spiritual experience in which they felt like they, again, it wouldn't have to be everybody, but if there was a group of people who all of a sudden got together and said, you know what, there's only one God, all these other gods, and if they came to that conclusion together, living in an environment where all the other, tribes were, worshiping, multiple gods, I can see how they might have derived from that experience that they felt that they were being selected to be the vehicles for this insight. But I would say, even if we could somehow, come to a conclusion that something like that might have happened, that they were wrong in their inference. But yeah, and the Messiah piece, absolutely, the Messianic age, for me, is far superior and more desirable than the idea that a single individual is going to serve as the the transformer of our world. So totally, 100% with you on that. Thank you. Thanks. Joel and Louise.
So just in terms of the question of Jewish education and young people, and think about Cleveland is that we now have several Reconstructionist young rabbis. And so it will be interesting to see what happens in the next 10 years as those people have kids and bring in friends, and it's
Yes,
we might be growing.
Yeah, we might be. In terms of Jewish education, I think the sort of level of sort of rigorous Jewish education has been going down in like all the movements. Rigorous for kids, the number of days, whatever. It just different than when I was growing up.
right.
I mean, even within the conservative movement, it's,
Look, I'm assuming we'll go back to activities with congregations that are within driving distance. I'm assuming we'll go back to that, because I think camps and also those, twice a year or 3 times a year Shabbatons or whatever with somebody in Pittsburgh or Buffalo or Erie or Detroit or Ann Arbor or something. Those are much more bonding to youth than the classes on Saturday or Sunday morning. And so those in the camps really are very, very, very important. Ramah was enormously formative of the conservative movement, including its progress, because I don't know, if somebody didn't want women to have be treated equally in the conservative movement, they surely were foolish to treat them equally at Ramah.
Well, right. I mean, it's interesting that I think Rabbi Starr mentioned this last week, that in some ways the great success of Camp Ramah created a lot of problems for the conservative movement, because the kids who went to Ramah and felt a connection and felt empowered would come back to their home synagogues and not, from what my understanding is, at least, this is the narrative that I've heard from people in the conservative movement, that they were, most often disappointed by the Jewish experiences of their own synagogues in comparison to the camp experience.
And they were sufficiently disappointed that they changed the synagogues.
They changed the synagogues, and they joined Chavarot and egalitarian minions.
We were an egalitarian minion that was really a spinoff of a conservative congregation. The congregation would lend them a Torah scroll that women could read from, because they couldn't read from it inside the synagogue. So and eventually that movement of Chavarot, eventually the synagogues decided they wanted dues-paying members. So they found a way. But anyway, camps are powerful, youth groups are powerful, whatever you want to call them, these weekend get-togethers. That's really where the power is. It's not so much in the classes.
And we really want to make sure that everybody can afford it.
Yeah, great.
Yeah, so we it has to be
accessible.
Financial aid has to be available for those who need it. Yeah.
Thank you both. Thank you both. All right, Judy.
Not to go too far into this on education, but I do want to point out one other thing that is maybe very remarkable about Reconstructionism, and that is that almost, I would say nobody, but I won't say that for sure, in this group, on this call, was raised in a Reconstructionist setting. So I think maybe the movement, and I'll just play devil's advocate for a minute, maybe the movement doesn't need to focus tremendous resources on very young people. I'm being a little bit of a devil's advocate, because people from a variety of backgrounds, as they become more mature, as they start thinking about things through for themselves, being in an American milieu and having some Jewish education, be it conservative, be it reform or whatever, that's how most of us got here. And so I think there is great hope that the movement can continue in that respect, offering very stimulating experiences that are not always family oriented. Because in some of the other shuls or movements or things, so much focus is on kids and families that people who are older feel there isn't the stimulation and the companionship and the intellectual development that they need to feel connected. And I think that is one of the good things about Kol Halev and about many Reconstructionist shuls. And just keep in mind where we all came from, which was a lot of different backgrounds, and realize that can happen to others who are in different places today.
Thank you, Judy. I appreciate that. That's helpful. All right, Bruce and Catherine, I think you guys are going to get the last word here.
Okay, at this point, it's Bruce with the question.
Okay.
And that is, you in your description tonight, you had Kaplan and you had Reconstructionism. Is that like how do I word this? Is really Kaplan was the entire origin of the Reconstructionism? Like, is that the way we should think about it, to just draw this line from Kaplan to not the institutional movement? Because I know there were other people, Ira Eisenstein and so forth, but intellectually, was it really the arrow is Kaplan and Reconstructionism, period?
Great question. I wish Rabbi Deborah were here to answer. My sense is that the vast majority of Reconstructionist thought, the foundation of Reconstructionist thought, was in fact produced by Kaplan. And his students expanded on that. Ira Eisenstein, in some cases they took his ideas and went further than he did with them. But I think that for the first, like, the rabbinical school was founded in 1968, and I think for the first 20 years of the rabbinical school, it was really, Kaplan's ideas were at the center of the curriculum. I think that's Kaplan's term, Kevin. I think he called it Reconstructionism, and I would say that, and this is, maybe this is a good place to, to conclude the conversation this evening. So what happened in the late 80s is that Art Green became the president of RRC, who was not a Reconstructionist per se, but he was a scholar of Jewish mysticism who was in Philadelphia, and I think certainly appreciative of the Reconstructionist project. Anyway, he became president of RRC, and Philadelphia was really identified as one of the great centers of what I'm going to now call neo-Hasidism, which overlaps to some extent with the Jewish renewal movement, but I think it's a larger concept. The idea of taking the core ideas, the core concepts from the Hasidic movement and applying them in a modern context, and taking them out of the making them more universal and less particularistic. And so Art Green, as a scholar of the Jewish mystical tradition, and in particular a scholar of the Hasidic tradition and the neo-Hasidic energies in Philadelphia from the late 80s up until the turn, up until 2000, if not further, meant that a lot of people that came through RRC had more of an admixture of Kaplanian content and neo-Hasidic content, and I would count myself in that group, and so at that point there was the beginning of the process of, I think, getting a little bit of distance intellectually from Kaplan as a philosopher. And I think people who were drawn to the neo-Hasidic stuff would say, one of the main critiques of Kaplan coming from that corner was this notion, there was a sense, and this may or may not be fair or accurate, but it was a sense that people had of Kaplan that he was so driven by rational considerations that the non-rational dimensions of human experience did not play an important enough role in his thinking. And so the neo-Hasidic branch of Reconstructionism was interested in recalibrating the balance between the non-rational and the rational parts of religious experience. Not to the extent, not to go back into a pre-modern way of thinking, but recognize that even in a modern context that there was a non-rational dimension to, or there could be. So I think that's, so in my own rabbinic training, I would say there was this kind of mixture of Kaplanian thought and Neo-Hasidism, some of which came from my fellow students, the Neo-Hasidism piece, and not just from, not necessarily from all of our faculty. So I just want to thank everybody for being here. This was really great, great questions and conversation. And I want to thank Alan Fetterman again for organizing this series. And I hope everyone will be able to come back next Wednesday to hear Rabbi Allison Van talk about Reform Judaism from her perspective. And then Rabbi Simcha Zevet will be... Close. Yes. Sorry.
Before we close, could we also do a little bit of housekeeping? How do we access the recordings of these sessions?